whose book, Resurrection and Moral Imagination, we're basing this series on, she has this idea that rather than seeing the resurrection, we should be seeing from the resurrection. What does she mean by that?
I think in the first place, she means that the resurrection isn't a thing that happens to Jesus. There's this event that allows us to complete the sequence of the creed. The resurrection is something utterly, utterly fundamental that isn't simply a thing that involves Jesus, but is a renewal of the whole of creation, that the universe is different. And that creates a different world, a new kind of world, from which we see everything and from which we make our moral decisions. She calls this a moral imagination. That's a framework, a view of things out of which or within which we make moral choices and have conversations about moral subjects. And her contention is that the resurrection has created a new moral imagination out of which we look at the world, all of the world, the social world, the moral world. The whole thing is different because we see from the resurrection.
So how crucially does it change things, this new moral imagination?
Well, let me follow one of her really main lines of argument. We construct our moral universe conventionally in terms of good and bad. We have good and we have bad, and the object is to choose the good and to follow the good and to live the good as opposed to the bad. And Bachelard says, but in the light of the resurrection, actually, we've gone to a different place. The trouble with good and bad is that good is then defined in opposition to the bad. And in order to sustain your sense of the good, you have to be always excluding the bad. And in order to sustain your sense of yourself as a good person, you have to be excluding bad people. So the oppositional dynamic of good and bad, as most kind of human societies live it, inevitably leads you to systems of exclusion and even of violence. There's a tendency in that direction. What Jesus has shown us in going at the cross to the place of shame and violence and death, and proving its utter irrelevance, is he's inaugurated a realm not of good with a little g as opposed to bad, but of goodness with a capital G, as Bachelard spells it. And that makes possible a completely new way of behaving and being in relation to one another.
It's a wonderful thought, but what does it do to the notion of judgment?
Well, let me develop it with a biblical story, which Bachelard pays a little attention to, but I think you could make even more of it. And that's the story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. Now, adulteries are bad, and the marriage bond is utterly good, and societies invest heavily in defending the sanctity of marriage and in proscribing adultery. But the traditional way of defining good and bad and having the satisfaction for ourselves of knowing that we are among the good is that you exclude the bad thing, the bad person, and you find yourself at the beginning of this story in a place of real violence where she's about to be stoned to death, because that's how the logic of good and bad works. Comes Jesus into that situation, and he sees every person in it with a total and infinite compassion. He doesn't undercut the notion that the woman has done wrong. Go and sin no more. She is named as a sinner. What she has done is named as sin. But we've escaped the logic of punishment and death. We've gone to a place of compassion, which discloses, it shows a lot of things. It shows a divine mercy to the woman. It holds up a mirror to the people who are about to throw the stones and teaches them something about who they are. And so people leave having been transformed by this encounter, and judgment, for now, simply does not enter into the equation. Doesn't mean that judgment isn't an important idea. Doesn't mean that, but it's something that for now we human beings have to surrender. We have to hand over judgment to God God will judge in God's way, out of God's infinite compassion, in God's time. In the meantime, we're not to judge, not even ourselves. And I think that's a very interesting idea.
Absolutely.
That self-judgment is also something that is handed over to God.
Yes, yes. As she said, it's a reconciling judgment rather than a condemning judgment.
Yes.
So you get that wonderful story, don't you, when Jesus comes back to the disciples, they've deserted him. He says nothing about the desertion. But there's the painful moment in John's Gospel when he asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?"
Yes.
And poor Peter's standing there. I mean, in bits, because he should remember, of course, he denied him 3 times. But yes, he loves him, and Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." He still wants him. He still wants him to be the rock on which his church is built.
Yes. But you have to go back to an earlier look, and that is when Jesus looks at Peter in the courtyard of the high priest's house, and Peter understands what he has done. And that look, I mean, how one would want to know exactly what that look was like. That look sets off a process of breaking and healing in Peter himself.
Yeah.
And he lets himself be broken by it. And he understands himself to be forgiven, and that then plays out in the resurrection stories.
Yes.
And when I preach on Good Friday, I've often made a contrast between Peter, who lets himself be broken, and Judas, who does not. Judas also betrays Jesus, but in his pride, Judas cannot come. And when they give him the 30 pieces of silver, and he realises that they think he was in it for the money, the humiliation breaks him. And so he goes out and hangs himself.
Now, William last week gave us a terrific exposition on models of atonement and so forth, and talked about ransom, which is actually fundamental to traditional Christian thinking about what went on. And of course, Jesus talked to himself as being ransom. What happens to ransom in Bachelard's thinking? We can only infer this because she doesn't address it directly. But what happens to ransom, given her thesis?
I think ransom falls away as an idea in her understanding of the cross, as also in that of James Allison, a Roman Catholic theologian that she draws on quite heavily in her thinking about this. Ransom falls away. Now, there are 2 kind of concepts of ransom in the history of Christian thinking about the cross. There's a very old one, which we don't make much of now, that Jesus' death is a tasty piece of meat thrown to the devil.
That's right.
A ransom paid to the devil.
Food, isn't it, the devil? That's right.
And he kind of gorges himself on this, but he can't digest it, and it destroys him. The other is the notion, the kind of accountant's theory, if you like, that human sinfulness creates an overdraft in a celestial bank that needs to be paid off. That's not quite strictly ransom, but that's a way of a very, very deeply influential way of thinking about atonement, that a debt has to be paid.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, if I owe money at the bank, my bank manager doesn't care how it's paid off, just so long as the account is cleared. That's quite problematical in the moral universe. If I've done something wrong, how does someone clear the debt that comes from my wrongdoing? And Bachelard and Allison, they go to a different sort of place.
Yes.
They talk about Jesus allowing himself to be carried by the human dynamic of the ordinary way we construct good and evil, to be excluded, to be taken to the place of shame and death, and there voluntarily and out of love, he gives his life. And that subverts the whole system of the conventionally good and the conventionally bad. And the power of that self-giving love, that self-dispossession, creates this new reality, which is the resurrection, of which the bodily resurrection of Jesus is a first fruit and a sign, but the resurrection is so much more than simply that Jesus is risen from the dead. So you could say that Bachelard's created a new moral imagination, or the resurrection creates a new moral imagination. And that's a different moral imagination from the moral imagination in which traditional understandings of satisfaction theory atonement work.
Anders, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.